"Ma'am, staff waits outside until they're called." The voice cut through the ballroom with the kind of polished contempt that made people look up before they meant to. Crystal chandeliers glowed over the Blackstone Hotel's executive reception, throwing white light across champagne glasses, navy suits, and the gold-trimmed name cards set for the most powerful people in the room. At the center of it all, Naomi Carter stood beside a long marble table stacked with sealed vote packets, one hand resting lightly on the top folder, her expression unreadable. She wore a tailored black suit, simple diamond studs, and the kind of calm that usually made people lower their voices around her. But Richard Whitmore didn't lower his. The billionaire investor glanced at her the way people looked at furniture they expected someone else to move. Then he flicked 2 fingers toward a silver coffee service near the wall. "If you're going to stand there," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "at least make yourself useful." A hush moved outward in rings. Not full silence. Not yet. Just the sharp little pause of wealthy people realizing something ugly had been said in public and deciding, all at once, not to be the first one to react. Naomi didn't move. Around her, donors and board members pretended to keep talking, but their eyes had already shifted. A woman near the investor table stopped with her champagne halfway to her mouth. A junior associate looked down at his phone without unlocking it. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh no," under their breath. Richard kept going because men like him always mistook silence for permission. He stepped closer, expensive smile fixed in place, and nodded toward the folders in Naomi's hand. "Set those in the boardroom, then find whoever's handling drinks. We're voting in less than 10 minutes, and tonight is too important for confusion." His voice carried the oily confidence of a man who had spent years being the loudest person in every room and watching people call it leadership. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his. She said nothing for a second, and that second stretched just long enough to make the air feel thin. Richard noticed her composure and seemed to take it personally. "Did you not hear me?" he asked, a little sharper now, as if her stillness itself were disrespect. "Or do people give you a title now and suddenly you forget how to do basic work?" A few faces tightened. One of the hotel event staff froze beside the ballroom doors, unsure whether to step in or disappear. At the far end of the room, board chair Evelyn Brooks had just entered, speaking quietly with general counsel, but she was still too far away to hear the words clearly. Richard didn't know that. He thought the room was his. He thought the vote was already his. He thought the woman holding the future of the company in her hands was there to serve him coffee. Naomi's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. Not warmth, not amusement. Something colder than either. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, and somehow more arresting than his had been at full volume. "You should be very careful," she said, "about assuming who works for whom." A few people turned fully now. The room felt smaller. Richard gave a short laugh, too quick, too brittle, already leaning on the version of reality he preferred. "Cute," he said. "Bring the packets in, and maybe try not to slow down the people making real decisions tonight." Naomi looked at him for one more steady second, then shifted the folders in her hand and started toward the boardroom doors. Richard smirked and followed, unaware that every eye in the ballroom had moved with them, and that in less than 10 minutes, the woman he had just called staff would be the one deciding whether he left that building with power or without it. The double doors to the boardroom opened without ceremony, but the air inside felt different from the ballroom, colder, tighter, sharpened by money and timing. The long walnut table stretched beneath recessed lights, every leather chair already marked with a nameplate, every screen on the wall dark except for the company seal waiting in silence. Naomi Carter walked in first with the vote packets balanced neatly in her arms, her pace unhurried, her posture so controlled it almost made the room seem to steady around her. Richard Whitmore came in behind her wearing the same satisfied expression, like he had already begun spending a victory no one had officially handed him yet. He moved toward the head of the table, loosening one cuff, glancing around at the empty chairs reserved for the board as if he could already see who belonged to him. "Set them there," he said, pointing toward the center stack of briefing books without looking directly at Naomi. And make sure legal gets the revised proxy count. We are not wasting time tonight. Naomi placed the packets down with exact care. The sound of paper touching polished wood was somehow louder than it should have been. Richard mistook her silence for obedience and kept talking. I told them this would be cleaner if they stopped dressing operations people like executives, he said, smoothing his tie in the black glass reflection of the wall monitor. It confuses the room. He smiled faintly at his own line. Then again, confusion is useful when people need to be reminded who actually runs a company. Naomi did not answer. She adjusted one packet by less than an inch, aligning the edges until the stack looked precise enough to cut. Outside the room, footsteps approached. Voices. The board was arriving. Richard lowered his voice not out of respect, but because men like him knew exactly when to become strategic. By the end of tonight, he said, turning toward her at last, the adults will have this place back. That one was meant to land. It hung there between them, smug and practiced, until Naomi lifted her eyes and met his again. You seem very sure of the count, she said. Her tone was even almost conversational, and that was what made him answer too quickly. I do not gamble with outcomes, he said. I shape them. Then the first board members entered, and the room changed all at once. Evelyn Brooks came in with Daniel Reeves at her side, both carrying folders and the tired focus of people who had spent the day preparing for a fight they hoped would stay civilized. Behind them came Marcus Hale, Olivia Grant, and three outside directors still speaking in low voices that stopped the second they saw Naomi standing at the head of the table. Not near it, not beside it, at it. One by one, their expressions shifted. Marcus caught it first and looked from Naomi to Richard, then back again like he was confirming whether the scene unfolding in front of him was really happening. Olivia's eyes dropped to the packets, then rose to Naomi's face, and whatever she read there made her very still. Richard noticed the silence, but not the reason for it. He assumed it was tension over the vote. He gave the room a statesman's smile, too broad, too confident, the kind men wear when they think history is about to agree with them. Big night, he said to the board as he took 2 steps toward the head chair. Let us finally bring some order back into this place. No one answered him. Evelyn set her folder down first. Daniel did not sit. Marcus looked away, pressing his lips together as if keeping something from escaping at the wrong moment. Olivia reached for her phone, then thought better of it. Richard's smile weakened by a fraction. Then Naomi pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. Not dramatically, not fast, just with the quiet authority of someone taking a seat that had never belonged to anyone else. The leather settled under her. The room went completely still. Richard stopped moving. His eyes flicked to the brass plate in front of her place setting as if it had only just come into focus. Chief Executive Officer, Naomi Carter. The color in his face changed so slightly that most people would have missed it, but the room did not miss anything now. Evelyn folded her hands and looked directly at Naomi. Madam Chief Executive Officer, she said clearly, giving every word time to land. We have quorum. Richard stared as though the language itself had turned against him. Naomi rested one hand beside the vote packets he had told her to carry and looked up at the board with calm that felt almost merciless. Good, she said. Then let us begin. Richard Whitmore did not sit. For a man who had walked into the room expecting control, standing still was the first crack. His gaze stayed fixed on the brass nameplate in front of Naomi Carter, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less humiliating if he stared long enough. Around the table, nobody rushed to save him. That was the part he had not planned for. Men like Richard were used to immediate rescue. A laugh from the right person. A smooth explanation. A junior executive eager to turn the room back in his favor. But none of that came. The boardroom held its silence like a verdict waiting to be read. Naomi opened the top packet and slid one copy toward Evelyn Brooks, then one toward Daniel Reeves, then the next across the table with calm, efficient movements that made the room feel even more under her control. Richard finally found his voice, but it came out thinner than before. I was not informed there had been a seating adjustment. No one answered right away. Marcus Hale lowered himself into his chair with the careful expression of a man who knew he was watching something expensive collapse in real time. Olivia Grant sat next, placing her phone face down beside her notepad, though her eyes kept drifting toward Richard with the alert distance people use around public embarrassment. Daniel remained standing for one extra beat, legal folder tucked under his arm, as if even he wanted the silence to do a little more work before the meeting began. Naomi looked up at Richard with the same composed expression she had worn in the ballroom. "There has not been a seating adjustment," she said. "There has been a failure of observation." That landed harder than a raised voice would have. A small breath moved through the room. Not laughter. Something tighter. The recognition that she could have humiliated him right there and had chosen precision instead. Richard's jaw set. He took the chair to Naomi's right, but the movement lacked dignity now. It had the clipped stiffness of a man trying to look intentional after walking into the wrong door. He placed both palms on the table, then withdrew them, noticing too late that the gesture looked unsteady. "If this is how you want to open a governance meeting," he said, forcing a smile no one believed, "then perhaps we should all be very clear about why we are here." Naomi folded her hands. "I agree." Evelyn glanced from one face to another, measuring temperature the way only a board chair could. "Then let us proceed with the agenda," she said. "First item, review of the merger proxy and executive confidence motion." That phrase changed the room. Chairs settled. Eyes lifted. This was no longer social humiliation. This was structure, process, power written in paper and timing. Richard straightened at the words executive confidence motion, and for a moment some of his color returned. He had not lost hope. He thought he still had the count. He thought numbers would protect him where appearances had failed. Naomi saw the calculation, happened behind his eyes, and said nothing. That silence unnerved him more than any challenge could have. He turned toward Evelyn, finding a more familiar rhythm in procedure. "Before we begin," he said, "I want the record to reflect that there appears to have been confusion tonight regarding personnel roles and access." Olivia's eyes lifted instantly. Marcus looked down at his notes. Daniel slowly sat. Nobody missed what Richard was trying to do. He was reaching for language that sounded administrative enough to blur what had really happened. Naomi let him finish. That was what made it worse. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She simply allowed his words to sit in the air long enough for everyone to hear the desperation under the polish. When he stopped, she tilted her head slightly and asked, "Are you referring to the moment you mistook the chief executive officer for hotel staff in a room full of investors 5 minutes before a board vote?" The room did not move. Richard's face tightened. The question was not loud. It did not need to be. It was clean, public, irreversible. He opened his mouth, but no answer came fast enough. Naomi turned one page in front of her, then looked toward Evelyn. "Madam Chair," she said, "before we discuss confidence, I believe the board should first discuss judgment." Evelyn Brooks did not answer immediately. She let Naomi's last words settle over the walnut table and into the spaces between the people who, 10 minutes earlier, had still believed tonight would follow an older script. Judgment. It was the kind of word that made expensive rooms uncomfortable because it sounded moral, and money preferred language that felt procedural. Daniel Reeves opened his folder at last, sliding a tab section forward with the quiet precision of a man who knew exactly how damaging silence could be when paired with documents. Richard Whitmore saw the motion and tried to recover ground before the room could turn fully against him. "Let us not be theatrical," he said, drawing his shoulders back. "A misunderstanding at a reception is not relevant to the company's strategic direction." His tone aimed for dismissive, but strain had crept in around the edges. Naomi did not look at him. She looked at Evelyn. "With respect, Madam Chair, it is relevant if the board is being asked to consider leadership fitness while one of its most vocal power brokers cannot identify the chief executive officer, treats her as service labor in front of investors, and then attempts to recast that failure as administrative confusion." Nobody moved. Marcus Hale's pen stopped over his notes. Olivia Grant folded her hands and stared at the center of the table, not because she was bored, but because she understood exactly how ugly the next 15 minutes could become. Evelyn exhaled once through her nose. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "from a governance standpoint, is the incident relevant?" Daniel lifted his eyes from the folder. "If the concern before the board is executive confidence, then the conduct of the individuals attempting to influence that confidence is relevant, particularly if their behavior creates reputational exposure, evidences impaired judgment, or suggests bias that could compromise board independence." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The legal language landed with cold weight. Richard turned toward him too fast. "Bias?" he said. "That is an absurd stretch." "Is it?" Naomi asked. That was all. 2 words. Calm. Exact. Richard looked at her and made the mistake of trying to win the room through force of personality one more time. "I made an assumption in a crowded room," he said. "Everyone does. We are here to discuss whether this company is being run competently, not to indulge personal offense." Olivia's eyes lifted now. "There is a difference," she said carefully, "between a mistaken assumption and public behavior that every investor in that ballroom can interpret for themselves." Richard's head snapped toward her. He had not expected her to speak. Naomi noticed that. She noticed everything. Outside the boardroom, muted footsteps passed the frosted glass. Staff moving. Assistants waiting. The regular machinery of corporate life continued just beyond the door. But inside the room the pressure had changed. Richard could feel it. So could everyone else. He reached for the one thing he still believed he controlled. "Fine," he said, flattening both hands on the table. "Then let us stop circling and call the vote. We all know why we are here. The merger needs stable leadership, and some of us are no longer convinced that exists at this table." Naomi finally turned her head and looked directly at him. Her expression did not harden because it did not need to. It had already become something much more dangerous than anger. It had become certainty. "You are right about one thing," she said. "We should stop circling." She slid a slim folder from beneath the top packet and placed it in the center of the table. The tab was marked in black letters. Proxy count and communications record. Several people leaned forward without meaning to. Richard's eyes dropped to the folder, then back to Naomi, and for the first time that night, his confidence did not flicker. Stalled. Richard Whitmore stared at the folder in the center of the table, the way men stare at a locked door they were certain had always opened for them. The black tab looked harmless, clean, corporate, but the room reacted before anyone touched it. Marcus Hale leaned back instead of forward, which told Naomi he had already guessed enough to become careful. Olivia Grant's eyes moved once from the tab to Richard's face, and that was all. Daniel Reeves simply uncapped his pen. He had the expression of a man who did not need surprises to understand consequences. Evelyn Brooks rested her fingertips on the edge of her legal pad and said, "What is in the record, Ms. Carter?" Naomi answered without hurry. "A timeline of off-channel communications related to tonight's vote. Private outreach to sitting directors. Suggested pressure language. Promised committee influence. Suggested post-merger appointments. Proxy assumptions presented as fixed outcomes before the board had even convened." Richard gave a short laugh, but it came out with no warmth in it. "You make normal coalition building sound criminal." Naomi turned the folder so the tab faced Evelyn. "I make it sound documented." That changed the air again. Richard reached for his water glass, then seemed to think better of letting anyone see the movement. "Every board member in America talks before a vote," he said. "That is not misconduct. That is how decisions get made. Not when one interested party frames the outcome as predetermined while negotiating future control in exchange for support," Daniel said, opening the first page Evelyn had slid toward him. "That is not discussion. That is influence risk." Richard looked at him sharply. "Influence risk is not a real standard." "It becomes very real," Naomi said, "when investors, counsel, and directors all start using the same phrase on the same night." She opened her own copy and read with calm that felt almost surgical. Quote, Once Naomi is neutralized, the adults can restore discipline and place finance under steadier hands. End quote. Nobody in the room had to ask where they had heard adults before. Richard knew it too. His face tightened by a fraction. He had used the same word minutes ago, carelessly, repeatedly, like a man who assumed language only counted when powerful people were listening, and even then only if they wanted it to. That could mean anything, he said. Olivia spoke before Naomi could. No, it cannot. Her voice was controlled, but the edge was there now. It means someone was speaking about a sitting chief executive officer as an obstacle to be managed before process had run. Richard turned toward her. You are overreading ordinary strategy. Olivia held his stare. I work in communications. Ordinary strategy does not include public humiliation before a confidence motion. Silence again. Not empty this time. Loaded. Richard felt it and shifted tactics. Fine, he said. Let us be honest then. The company needs stronger stewardship. The market has been watching this merger for 6 months. We cannot walk into integration with uncertainty at the top. There it was. Not apology. Not retreat. He was still trying to force the room back onto terrain he understood, the old playbook of performance disguised as pragmatism. Naomi let him speak until his own certainty started sounding rehearsed even to him. Then she asked, Would you like the board to also review the messages where you counted votes you did not have? Richard said nothing. Naomi lifted one sheet from the folder and slid it toward Evelyn. Printout. Time-stamped. Clean. Undeniable. Marcus leaned forward now despite himself. Evelyn read the line once, then a second time, slower. Her expression did not change, but the room did. Richard saw it happen in real time. A shoulder tightened. A gaze dropped. Olivia no longer looked uncertain. Daniel no longer looked neutral. Evelyn placed the page flat on the table and lifted her eyes to Richard with a levelness that felt worse than anger. Mr. Whitmore, she said, why were you telling directors this vote was already decided before ballots were distributed? Richard Whitmore did not answer right away. For the first time that night, the silence belonged to someone else. His eyes stayed on Evelyn Brooks, but the rest of the room had already begun to shift away. From him in small, expensive ways. Marcus Hale no longer pretended to look undecided. Olivia Grant had turned her chair just enough to square herself to the table, not to Richard. Daniel Reeves had stopped taking notes because he no longer needed more evidence to understand what he was looking at. Richard finally drew a breath and tried to put authority back into his voice. Because I believed it was decided, he said. Based on the conversations I had, based on the concerns several people here have expressed for months, and based on the fact that this company cannot afford another year of instability dressed up as discipline. Naomi Carter did not react to the insult. She let it sit there, thin and obvious. Evelyn looked down at the page in front of her again. That would be more persuasive, she said. If the language in these messages reflected concern for the company instead of concern for your position after the merger. Richard turned toward her. My position is tied to the company's position. No, Naomi said softly. That is exactly the assumption that created this problem. The room went still again. She opened a second section of the folder and slid 3 stapled pages toward Daniel, then one toward Marcus, then one toward Olivia. Page 4, she said. The exchange from Tuesday at 8:14 p.m. Paper moved. I scanned. Marcus's face changed first. His mouth tightened, not in shock, but in the weary anger of a man who hated being made to feel late to the truth. Olivia read faster, then slowed down near the bottom, her gaze sharpening at one phrase after another. Daniel did not change expression at all, which somehow made it worse. Richard watched their faces and understood before anyone spoke that the room had just moved beyond embarrassment. This is selective, he said. This is context stripped from strategy. Naomi folded her hands over her copy. Then give us the context. Richard opened his mouth and closed it again. On the wall behind Naomi, the company seal glowed on the dormant screen, blue and silver and cold. Everything in the room looked expensive. Everything in the room looked permanent. That was the lie power always told itself right before the floor shifted. Evelyn lifted her page and read aloud in a measured voice that made each word hit harder. Quote, "Once the vote is secured, Naomi can remain outward-facing for optics, but operational authority should move quietly to people investors trust." End quote. Nobody spoke. Olivia looked up first. "Outward-facing for optics," she repeated, not to ask, but to make him hear himself. Richard straightened. That line referred to post-merger messaging discipline. "No," Naomi said. "It referred to me." He turned toward her too fast. "Do not make this personal." Naomi held his gaze. "You already did that in the ballroom. That one landed deeper than the others because it connected everything. Not just the folder. Not just the count. The whole pattern. The private language. The public disrespect. The assumption underneath both." Richard looked around the table, searching now not for support, but for hesitation. He found almost none. Marcus set his packet down and said, "You were planning authority transfer language before the board had even heard the final recommendation." Richard pounced on the one point that still sounded technical enough to survive. "I was preparing for continuity." Daniel answered before Naomi could. "Continuity for whom?" Richard said nothing. The question hung over the table like something heavier than law. Naomi reached for one final page and slid it toward Evelyn. "There is one more item the board should see before any confidence motion proceeds." Evelyn took the sheet. Her eyes moved once across the text, then again. Slower. This time even her composure shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for the room to notice. Richard saw that too, and whatever was left of his earlier certainty finally gave way to something colder. Naomi's voice stayed level. "That is the investor note that started circulating from the reception before we entered this room," she said. "The one describing exactly how you spoke to me in front of witnesses." Richard's face lost color. Olivia reached for the page before anyone offered it to her. Marcus leaned in. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You did not just misread the room," she said. "You exposed yourself in it." Olivia Grant read the investor note once, then a second time, and the controlled expression she had worn all evening finally gave way to something colder. "This is already moving," she said, placing the page flat on the table. "This did not stay in that ballroom." No one asked what she meant. They all understood. Rooms like this lived on private texts, whispered recaps, investor group chats, side calls from people who never appeared in minutes but shaped markets all the same. What happened in public did not remain public for long. It became narrative, then liability, then leverage. Richard Whitmore reached for the page, but Evelyn Brooks placed 2 fingers over it before he could touch it. The gesture was small. The message was not. "You have said enough for the moment," she told him. Richard pulled his hand back slowly, the humiliation of that tiny interruption somehow sharper than any accusation. Naomi Carter watched him without satisfaction on her face. That made it worse. If she had smiled, he could have called it revenge. If she had raised her voice, he could have called it emotion. But she was giving him nothing he could use except the truth of what he had already done. Marcus Hale shifted in his chair and looked across at Naomi with a new kind of caution. Not the kind reserved for a colleague in trouble, but the kind reserved for someone who had been underestimated and had kept count anyway. "How many people have seen that note?" he asked. Olivia answered immediately. "Enough." Her eyes stayed on the paper. 3 institutional contacts texted me before we sat down. One asked whether the board intended to proceed as if nothing happened. Another asked whether the company had a succession issue. The third asked whether this was going to become a governance story before morning. Richard gave a short, strained laugh. "Investors love drama when they are bored. That means nothing. It means they are watching judgment in real time," Naomi said, "and they are deciding which part of this room looks stable." Daniel Reeves folded his hands over the legal folder in front of him. "For the record," he said, "the reputational question is no longer hypothetical. That sentence did something final to the room. It took the last refuge of ambiguity and closed it. Richard felt it. He looked from Daniel to Evelyn to Marcus as if one of them might still choose comfort over clarity. But comfort had become expensive. "You are all overcorrecting," he said. "A badly phrased interaction at a reception does not outweigh what this merger requires." Evelyn's eyes did not leave him. "No," she said. "But badly phrased assumptions, private vote counting, strategic language about neutralizing a sitting chief executive officer, and public conduct that now appears to investors as bias and arrogance might." Richard's jaw tightened. "Bias is your favorite word tonight." Naomi finally leaned back in her chair, the movement slight, controlled, and somehow more commanding than if she had leaned forward. "No," she said. "Pattern is." Silence again. Even the air conditioning seemed louder now. Beyond the frosted glass, a shadow paused near the door and then moved on. Someone outside sensing the pressure in the room and deciding not to enter. Inside, nobody reached for water. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody wanted to be the first person to look away. Richard tried one more time to climb back into authority. "Then call the confidence motion," he said. "If this board wants clarity, let us have it. Let everyone show where they stand." Naomi's eyes held his for one steady second, and then she turned to Evelyn. "I agree," she said. "It is time to show where everyone stands." Richard exhaled, almost relieved, because he still believed the night could return to the battle he had prepared for. He still thought the danger was the vote he came to win. Evelyn looked at Naomi, then at Daniel, then down at the documents spread across the table like pieces of a machine finally locking into place. When she spoke, her voice was calm, formal, and devastatingly precise. "Before any confidence motion regarding the chief executive officer," she said, "the chair is recognizing a different matter for immediate consideration." Richard's face changed. "Not much, just enough." Naomi placed both hands lightly on the table and said, "Madam Chair, I move that the board review Mr. Whitmore's conduct, influence attempt, and fitness to remain in a voting position before any other item proceeds." The room did not react all at once. That was what made it so brutal. No gasps, no raised voices, just a series of tiny, irreversible shifts. Marcus Hale set his pen down with deliberate care, as if he did not want even that small sound to interrupt the weight of what had just been placed before them. Olivia Grant did not look at Richard Whitmore anymore. She looked at Evelyn Brooks because that was where power had moved. Daniel Reeves turned one page in the folder, then another, and the soft slide of paper across polished wood sounded louder than it should have. Richard felt the change before anyone answered Naomi Carter's motion. "This is absurd," he said, and now the strain was no longer hiding. "You do not hijack a merger meeting because someone did not like a conversation at a reception." Naomi did not flinch. "No," she said. "You review a voting member's fitness when that member publicly humiliates the chief executive officer, privately counts votes he does not control, and attempts to shape board action through pressure and false certainty." Evelyn folded her hands. "Motion is on the table." The words were simple. The effect was not. Richard leaned forward, expensive voice sharpening into something less polished and more desperate. "Evelyn, be reasonable. If you indulge this now, you destabilize the company in the middle of a major transaction. That concern would carry more weight," Evelyn said. "If you had shown any concern for stability before tonight." He turned toward Marcus. "You know what this merger requires." Marcus looked at him for a long second, then said, "I know it does not require this." That landed hard. Richard shifted toward Olivia next, grasping for the allies he had walked into the room assuming he owned. "We cannot let optics dictate governance." Olivia's expression did not move. "Optics did not dictate this," she said. "Your behavior did." Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and exact. "From council's standpoint, the chair would be negligent not to address this before any confidence motion proceeds." Richard stared at him as though the language itself were betrayal. Around the table, nobody rushed in to soften it. Nobody offered him a bridge back to control. Naomi watched the silence tighten around him and understood something he did not yet fully grasp. He still thought this was salvageable. He still thought the board was having a temporary reaction. He still believed tone could overpower record. Evelyn looked down at the agenda, then placed it aside. That small act felt ceremonial. Final. "We will proceed," she said. "First, discussion. Then vote on whether Mr. Whitmore remains in a voting position for the remainder of this meeting and beyond." Richard's face changed. This time everyone saw it. He had expected a warning, a reprimand, a delay. He had not expected the room itself to turn into a mechanism. "Beyond?" he repeated. "You are seriously entertaining removal over this?" Naomi answered before Evelyn could. "Not over this," she said. "Because of all of it." She placed one fingertip on the investor note, then another on the communications record, then rested her hand beside the proxy count he had misrepresented as fixed. She did not need to say more. The pattern was already visible. Public contempt, private manipulation, strategic disrespect dressed up as leadership. Richard pushed back in his chair just slightly, enough for the leather to sigh against the floor. He tried to recover height, certainty, menace, anything that had worked for him in older rooms. "If you do this," he said, voice dropping, "you will divide the board permanently." Naomi's eyes stayed on him, steady and almost merciless in their calm. "No," she said. "Tonight just reveals where it was already divided." That was the moment he lost the room. Not because people suddenly loved her. Not because anyone had become sentimental. But because every person at that table understood, in the same cold instant, that Naomi Carter had not come in hoping to survive the vote. She had come in prepared to define it. Evelyn lifted her gaze and said, "We will now hear final positions before the board votes on Mr. Whitmore's status." Richard swallowed once, slow and visible. Naomi reached for her ballot, turned it over without looking down, and placed it in front of her as if the ending had been waiting there the whole time. Evelyn Brooks gathered the ballots without ceremony. That was the cruelty of real power. It did not need theater because the room itself had already become the stage. One by one, the folded cards passed across polished walnut, white against dark wood, each one carrying far more weight than the paper should have held. Nobody spoke while she counted. Marcus Hale sat with both hands clasped in front of him, eyes fixed on the center of the table as if looking anywhere else would cheapen the moment. Olivia Grant did not blink often enough. Daniel Reeves watched with the stillness of a man who understood that consequences landed hardest when delivered quietly. Richard Whitmore sat rigid in his chair, the shape of confidence still visible on him only because it had been worn for so long. But it no longer fit. Naomi Carter did not look at the ballots. She looked at Richard, not angrily, not triumphantly, just steadily with the kind of calm that made it impossible for him to pretend this was confusion or bad luck or timing. This was judgment arriving in the language he respected most. Process. Evelyn set the stack down once, aligned the edges, and lifted her eyes. "By majority vote," she said, every syllable clean. "The board has determined that Mr. Whitmore is removed from voting participation effective immediately, pending formal review of his board status and related governance findings." The room stayed silent for one beat, maybe two. Then Richard gave a short, disbelieving breath that almost sounded like a laugh, except nothing in it was amused. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he said. No one rushed to contradict him. That was what made the truth unmistakable. He was no longer the center of the room. He was the item that had just been resolved. Evelyn slid the remaining merger ballot packet away from his reach without looking dramatic doing it. "You may remain seated as a non-voting observer while counsel completes the record," she said, "or you may step out." Richard looked from face to face, searching one last time for a crack in the decision. Marcus did not give him one. Olivia did not give him one. Daniel did not even look sympathetic. Then his eyes landed on Naomi, and whatever he intended to say faltered there. She had not raised her voice once. She had not begged the room to see what he was. She had simply let him reveal it. He stood too quickly, then steadied himself on the back of the chair as if pretending the motion had been deliberate. The silence followed him now, not respectful, not shocked, just absolute. At the far wall, a discreet knock sounded, and the boardroom assistant opened the door half an inch. She must have been waiting outside for instructions. Evelyn did not turn her head. "Mr. Whitmore is leaving the meeting," she said. "Please have access control suspend boardroom credentials pending legal follow-up." It was done with the same tone someone might use to request revised printouts before lunch. That was the final humiliation. Not outrage. Administrative finality. Richard's face emptied in stages. First disbelief. Then heat. Then that thin, pale look men get when power leaves faster than pride can follow. His phone lit up on the table. Once. Then again. Then again. Message after message. He glanced down and saw what the room had already understood. The story had outrun him. Investors, advisors, people asking questions in polished language that all meant the same thing. How bad is this? He reached for the device, but even that movement looked diminished now. Naomi gathered the remaining packets and straightened them into a perfect stack, the same way she had at the beginning of the night when he mistook composure for rank. She rose only after he had taken a step toward the door. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He stopped. The whole room did. He turned halfway back, not because he wanted to, but because something in her voice no longer allowed him the luxury of ignoring it. Naomi held his gaze and spoke with cool precision. "Next time," she said, "learn the room before you try to own it." No one breathed. No one moved. Richard looked at her as if he had finally, fully seen the person he had spent the evening trying to reduce. Then he walked out through the same door he had entered expecting victory, leaving behind the vote he thought he controlled, the power he assumed would protect him, and a room that no longer needed him for anything. Evelyn waited until the door closed softly behind him. Then she turned back to the table, to the company seal glowing on the screen, to Naomi standing where she had always belonged. "Madam Chief Executive Officer," she said, "shall we begin the real meeting?" Naomi sat, placed her hand on the merger packet, and answered in the same calm voice that had undone him from the start. "Yes," she said, "now we can."